today, just like all the other sessions we've had before this. My name is Jaideep Singh. I'm the Secretary General of the MUN at Home program at MUN Impact, and I will be moderating the discussion and the question and answer session for this particular session with Dr. McNeill. Just an introduction to Dr. McNeill. Dr. McNeill has worked for 25 years as a leader in the United Nations on sound environmental management for sustainable development in the developing world. And prior to this, he has worked in the UNDP's programs on forests, biodiversity, ecosystems, climate change, mitigation, sustainable energy, SDGs, public-private stakeholder partnerships. And throughout his career, he has devoted his special attention to engaging with empowering indigenous people and local communities. And recently he has founded the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, which he will tell us more about in his talk. So without any further ado, I have the honor of introducing Dr. McNeill to the floor. And Dr. McNeill, it's all yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jaideep, and it's an honor to be here with all of you. I'm aware that I'm speaking to the leaders of the future, the leaders of the world, the leaders that will help us address some of the issues that I'd like to discuss with you. And just to get a sense of where are you people? What parts are you all over the US or other countries? Who am I talking to? Can you give me a little bit of a sense and the geographic spread of the people out there?
Dr. McNeill, you can see the distribution on the chat. We have people all over from the USA, Malaysia, Philippines, India, Sudan, Finland, Ireland, Qatar, Egypt. It's all there for you to see.
Wow, how exciting. And the issues I want to talk about are really global issues that will require a global response. And what I was wanting to propose to talk about, and I want to take my guidance from you, but the things that I would like to tell you about is why do we need tropical forests? Why are they so important? What's the status of these forests today, and what's causing the loss of these forests? Also like to address what does it take to halt tropical deforestation? And I'd like to address the question, can we afford to protect forests given the need to feed the world? Is there a conflict there or not? And what about the role of indigenous peoples in protecting forests? What role do they play? And then faiths. Why are religions and faiths so important in dealing with this global problem? And maybe a little bit about the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative that you mentioned, Jaideep. Then I'd like to also address what actions individuals can take to protect tropical forests. What can we do in our own lives? And if people are interested, would like to touch on the topic of the global economic response to the pandemic. How is that going to impact forests, positively or negatively? What role can forests play? And then lastly, I'd like to touch on the issue of what are we learning from the Black Lives Matter movement for the cause of protecting tropical forests and indigenous people's rights. Now, that's more than the 10 or 15 minutes. It almost took me 10 minutes to list those issues. So I can't get to all of them in the first opening shot, but those are the kind of topics that I'm ready to address. Does that sound like it would be of interest to you? Okay. And I recall that there is a translator, so I want to be respectful and careful because I know how difficult it can be to try to translate these technical matters in another language. So if I get too excited and talk too fast, Jaideep or Natbar, others, maybe just wave and say some universal signal of slow down, or so that I behave myself. So why do we need tropical forests? First of all, they're critical to life on the planet in many ways. They're home to 80% of all the species on Earth, all the land-based species on Earth, 80% live in tropical forests. They regulate the global climate. They provide water, food, jobs for billions of people. When they're cut down, we lose all of these things, along with tens of millions of years of evolution that cannot be replaced. Where I am right now in Canada, the mountains here, 10,000 years ago, there was ice 1 mile above my head. All of the forests we see here are the result of just 10 or 11,000 years of evolution. The Amazon has not seen an ice age for 56 million years. So the Amazon is the result of 56 million years of evolution. That's a treasure of great value. Also, tropical deforestation is leading to animal-human interactions that did not exist previously. That's creating conditions for the emergence of new diseases that we have no resistance to, and that can be the basis for pandemics like COVID-19. So cutting down forests is leading to diseases like COVID. So in addition to all of this, deforestation it is a disaster for global climate. It's simply making the world a hotter, drier, and more dangerous place to live. And this is particularly unfortunate and regrettable because if we were to protect and restore these forests, they can actually solve the climate problem. We've done studies to show that 1/3 of the solution to stopping climate change comes from protecting forests. It's that simple. Also, forests are now known to generate rainfall across entire continents, ensuring the productivity of the world's agricultural systems, both locally, but also half a world away. The Amazon actually impacts food production in the US and many other places. And if tropical deforestation were a country, its annual contribution to climate change would be the 3rd highest in the world after the US and China. Can you imagine that? That's that significant. So it simply won't be possible to meet the Paris climate goals without decisive action to end tropical deforestation. So the point there is that this is a crisis of existential proportions. We either deal with it or leave it to your generation and the next generation, which will face ecological collapse. So that's kind of my opening shot across the bow is this is why tropical forests are so important, and this is why I'm working on this issue. I wanted to touch on this subject of what's the status, where are we in this battle to stop deforestation, and what's causing it? Should I go there, or did you want to stop and engage? Keep going?
McNeill, you can finish your talk, and then at the end we can take questions.
Okay, great. So despite some progress, instead of forests being, helping slow climate change, which is what we want and which is possible. If we protect and restore forests, we can literally deal with the climate problem. But instead, we're cutting so much that now it's driving climate change. And data from the Global Forest Watch report that came out a few weeks ago shows that we're losing precious tropical rainforests at a rate of a football field every 6 seconds throughout the year. So imagine that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. An entire football field of precious 56 million year old forest is gone every 6 seconds, every minute, every hour, every day, every week, every month, throughout the entire year. It's like crashing a plane every 6 seconds. And Brazil single-handedly has accounted for over a third of that loss in 2019. I don't mean to condemn any one country, but just the fact is that in last year, Brazil accounted for a third of all the loss. And that's especially troubling because the Brazil administration proposed new legislation in February to allow commercial mining and oil extraction within indigenous peoples' territories. And they've relaxed law enforcement efforts in the midst of the country's ongoing political, financial, and now COVID crisis. In a more positive sense, we saw last year that Indonesia decreased by 5% their deforestation rate. This is for the third year in a row, and that's the lowest in some years. Indonesia has had huge losses, but now they're seeming to turn in the other direction. So there's a lot more to say about the data, but the bottom line is the fight to curb tropical forest loss is far from over, and more action and leadership is needed. And so what is causing this loss? It's really actually fairly simple. Commercial scale clearing of forests, much of it illegal for agriculture, is now the primary driver of deforestation, especially to produce global commodities such as beef, soy, palm oil, and timber. And cattle ranching, to take one example, ranching for cattle drives 80% of deforestation in the Amazon. Isn't that amazing? 80% for cattle in the Amazon. And that suggests that one obvious intervention would be to reduce beef consumption. We can say more about that a little later. Maybe I'll just go through a couple more points, but tell me if I've spoken too long and it's time for comments. But the next point is, what does it take to stop tropical deforestation? Fortunately, we know what it will take to stop deforestation. And it comes down to public policies. And I'm thinking that this group I'm talking to, each of you around the world, that you people are going to be flexing your muscles and raising Cain, raising something in now and in the coming years, that you're going to be able to influence public policies. So that's why I was so excited to be able to talk to you, because as I said before, I know I'm talking to the future leaders of this planet. So it comes down to public policy. It's about laws and regulations. One, laws and regulations. It's about enforcing those laws and regulations, and it's about finance. And it requires strong government action supported by civil society and business. And to give one example, and I hope I'm not picking on Brazil, but I'm coming back to Brazil here. Although Brazil's deforestation rate is now exploding, this was not always the case. Between 2004 and 2012, Brazil actually succeeded in reducing large-scale deforestation in the Amazon by 80%. Can you imagine? And they did it by doing four things. One, they increased law enforcement. They just enforced the laws. Number two, they expanded protected areas. Number three, they recognized indigenous territories, the opposite of what's happening right now. And I hope we can talk more about the incredibly important role of indigenous peoples in protecting forests. And four, they applied certain financial incentives to slow conversion to agriculture, that there's certain policies that slow down that converting. And this dramatic reduction in forest loss happened at the same time that agricultural productivity increased, proving that we can protect forests while increasing food production. Normally people think, oh no, we can't protect forests because we have to produce food. No, you can actually do both. That link has been disconnected and disproved. In Indonesia, they did it by, they reduced deforestation by increasing law enforcement to prevent forest fires and land clearing and other things. Finance is key. We need to be able to pay countries and pay communities for protecting forests. We need to get rid of perverse subsidies where we're basically paying people to do the wrong thing in terms of overusing water and pesticides and fertilizers and energy. There's a policy environment there that needs to be tweaked and turned around. And then maybe the last thing is transparency. With the new remote sensing tools, it's amazing. Local communities and law enforcement can now see in real time illegal deforestation that's happening in their lands through drones and GPS and satellites and so on. So clearly there are solutions out there, but they need to be scaled up in a number of countries. So I wonder, should I stop there or go to a couple more points? What would?
Dr. McNeill, we can start with questions if you wish to do so. We have tremendous level of questions coming in, but if you want to go ahead and complete your points first, that's fine as well.
Okay, maybe a couple more. Back to that point about can we afford to protect forests given the need to feed the world? I touched on that. This is a huge misconception, and I really want us to understand that. We do not need to choose between forests or food. It's a false choice. We've already developed, paved over and worked. Over half of all the vegetated land on Earth has been developed, most of it for agriculture. And the truth is, that's enough. It's not a matter of claiming more land, but making better use of the land we already have. We can produce the food the world needs, even to feed the expected 10 billion people by 2050. While staying within our planetary boundaries. And there are three things that need to happen. One is we need to transform the world's food system to make it more efficient and effective, and there's lots of ways to do that. Number two, we need to shift our diets, and there needs to be a global shift in diets to more plant-based food. And three, we need to reduce food waste. Already we're wasting over a third of all the food that is produced, we're wasting, and that's a huge problem. So we don't need to destroy one more hectare of tropical forest in order to feed. That's an interesting and important development. And then maybe last thing before we open up, what is the role of Indigenous peoples in protecting forests? I think a lot of you are interested in that issue. And one thing that as you mentioned, Jadip, that I've been working with Indigenous peoples and local communities around the world over the last 25 years or so. And what we've seen is that one proven way to protect forests that should be rapidly scaled up is granting Indigenous peoples legal title to their traditional lands. Oh, just a second. Studies show that when Indigenous peoples' land rights are legally recognized and protected by governments, deforestation rates and greenhouse gas emission rates are significantly lower. You compare Indigenous-owned lands with government or private or even protected areas, and Indigenous-owned lands are better protected in terms of protecting biodiversity, protecting forests, and preventing climate change. In many parts of the world, and this is important, Indigenous peoples face serious threats as they defend their forests from incursions from industries, many of them illegal, most of them illegal, mining, logging, oil, poaching, agribusiness. And this has increased significantly over the past weeks and months due to COVID, as governments have withdrawn any protection for Indigenous communities. Just a second, I have to cough. So, perversely, Indigenous peoples are now being invaded and attacked and their lands taken, and any government protection that existed is now being withdrawn. And so it's a terrible situation, and Indigenous peoples are often more vulnerable even to these diseases than anyone else. So given their cultural and spiritual connections to forests, and given their vast stores of traditional knowledge, and the fact that much of the remaining world's tropical forests are within their ancestral lands, Indigenous peoples are essential partners in any efforts to protect rainforests. So maybe I'll stop there, and then as we talk to the questions, as we deal with questions, I can talk about why religions are important and how to build back better in a world of COVID, and what people can do to take action, and how the Black Lives Matter movement can educate us and give us a way forward on these other issues. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McNeill. Virtual round of applause for Dr. McNeill. That was certainly very, very enriching to all of us. Certainly something I love to hear, because I love ecology. I've studied it in high school. And this is something I'm really passionate about. I'd love to hear about this. So we now go into our Q&A session. And as I always do with all my Q&A sessions, we'll call out your name. You please come up, switch on your cameras. That would be really appreciated. Unmute yourself and ask your question. This way we can have a lot of interaction with our audience as well. On similar notes, I'll try to extend the discussion by bringing up follow-up questions, but let's start off with our delegates' questions first. And I'm going to go up to Emmanuel, who joins us from Ecuador, who has a question on how we can actually persuade the general public to know more about this issue or become more aware and concerned about it. So Emmanuel from Ecuador, please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, my question was, how can we persuade people to care more and respect the environment, as they take it as boring and not important, actually?
Great. And Jaideep, should we do one question at a time or take several questions? What's the?
One at a time, because they're not all linked to each other. So.
Great. So thank you, Emmanuel. So how to persuade people to take this seriously? Because environmental issues and so on may be considered boring. Well, I think we're seeing that the future of life on the planet now depends in a very real way. That it's no longer a question of convenience, whether to work on environment and protecting climate and biodiversity, because we're seeing the floods, the droughts, the fires, the extreme weather events. We're seeing such serious implications that that there's no way around it. If we're interested in having a future for you, your generation and your children, there's no alternative. It's that simple. So I think that, and it can't just be a story of doom and gloom, because saying that things are terrible and that we're facing a crisis sometimes doesn't motivate people. So I think we need to be addressing both the fact that it's a matter of life and death, that if we want to have a world for our children to experience love and joy and possibility and experience the beauty of the world, that we're going to have to take this seriously. So that's one side. And then the other side is that it's an opportunity for a whole new economy. There's opportunities for renewable energy and sustainable businesses, which will provide well-being and income for millions and millions of people. It's an alternative to a coal industry, which has no future and is suffocating life around the world. So we can say it's essential, and it's an attractive, compelling, interesting future for us. So, I don't have the answer. I think each of you will have to find ways in your own lives to communicate the importance of these issues, and maybe you can practice with your brothers and sisters and family and fellow students. You can practice. You can do kind of rehearsals with each other, try to convince each other. I think we need you all to be spokespeople out there around the world. So that's the best I can do on that. But thank you so much, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for the question. Let's now go on to another interesting question coming in from Natalie, who joins us from Malaysia. The very interesting thing I find about this is they all join us from countries with rich biodiversity. So we have Natalie from Malaysia, and her question is also something very interesting. So Natalie, go ahead. If you could switch on your camera and your mic. Yes.
Hi, Dr. McNeill. Thank you for your engaging words. My question is, how will we ensure to prevent deforestation and protect biodiversity, but also supporting the local communities who rely on resources from those places, because they rely on them for their economies and for development. So how will we ensure that both sides are met with? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Natalie. And I've had the pleasure, I think Dr. Bar too, at being in Malaysia and meeting the people, the indigenous peoples and the forests and so on. So I've had some experience there in your country. Well, fortunately, it's easier than you'd think, at least in my experience, that it's both possible to protect the forests and the biodiversity and the livelihoods of indigenous peoples. In many places, those goals are not in conflict. And I've spent some time over the past couple of years, mainly in the Amazon, but also in the Congo Basin. And I've met with indigenous peoples, and I've been amazed to see how important the forests are, protecting the forests are to their way of life and their livelihoods. They're the strongest advocates of protecting the forest. The indigenous peoples, the local communities are the ones who are advocating locally and regionally and nationally and even internationally to protect the forest. So I'm glad that conflict is not there often. I was deeply moved a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, I think I was in Brazil, and I traveled 3 days from Brasilia, which is the capital of Brazil, into this village. 3 days, can you imagine? Not from New York, but 3 days from the center of Brazil to get to this village. It's that far. It was a 5-hour flight, and then a 1-hour flight, and then a 5-hour canoe trip, and finally we got there. And when I got there, this was the Ashaninka people, and on the border of Brazil and Peru, and I spent time with the local shaman and the local community members, and I learned that the core commitment that is embedded in their culture, passed down from their ancestors for thousands of years, is to protect their forests, not only for their own survival, which is obvious, but explicitly because they feel a profound responsibility to protect their forests for the air, the water, the biodiversity, and the climate benefits needed for the survival of all human beings around the world. I was just shocked in this most remote place in the world to find that for thousands of years, their commitment has been, we must protect these forests, not only for ourselves, but for the whole planet. I was astonished to realize that this sense of responsibility for humankind is truly at the heart of their way of life. So that is part of the answer, Natalie, to your question, is that many groups are dedicated to protect the forest, but it's also true that they need economic opportunity in many places. And in Congo, for example, a lot of the deforestation is by local communities providing fuel wood, because most of the country does not have electricity, so that for cooking and heat, they need fuel wood. So if we stop that deforestation, there needs to be an alternative income. And I think that's at the core of your question, Natalie, is how do we design the system so that there can be alternative incomes. And this alternative economic development model is being developed in all of the 3 regions, the Amazon, the Congo, and the Asian forests. And in each part of the world, it looks a little differently. in some parts, industries like ecotourism and sustainable products. There's a whole raft of small-scale and large-scale industry and jobs that are being created as an alternative to the destructive ways of life. But so there's a lot of work going on and a lot of work needed on that. And Natalie, I think that's a really key point, that we need to keep putting attention on bolstering those alternative economic models in each of these regions. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for the question, Natalie. We are still in time, about 13 more minutes to go, so we can take a few more questions. Let's now talk to David, who joins us from, again, a very biodiversity-rich country, the Philippines. David has a question on when governments fail, what can non-government stakeholders do? So David, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. McNeill. Thank you for your presentation. So my question is, in the event of that a government does not prioritize the protection of forests, is there an avenue for effective change and protection through NGOs and individuals, given that we have a tight time frame to salvage what we can, and because technically we're playing catch up right now? So.
Thank you, David. Yes, another great question. And really, the issue of our day, and it's particularly urgent now with the pandemic and the response that that some governments are responding to this pandemic by saying, oh, we cannot afford to protect the environment. We have to do business as usual or even worse. And so your question is very relevant today, even more relevant than before the COVID, because some governments, like I'm seeing the US and again Brazil, are working hard to undermine environmental protection. Can you imagine at a time when mismanagement of the environment caused this pandemic? Now they're looking to roll back legislation and environmental protection. And so that's the wrong response, 100%. So what to do when the government doesn't provide the leadership that it needs to do? Well, this question is, I think, that civil society needs to get engaged. The NGOs of the world need to organize themselves. I think an example in another area, of course, is the Black Lives Matter. Look what happened, how in the US, people said enough is enough. And they got out in the street and they continue in the millions of people, and they forcing change. Every day we're seeing more and more change. So that's an example of people standing up and saying, no way, this shall not pass. We will take action. So I think that kind of movement is needed on the environmental issues for sure, because the kind of systemic discrimination against an oppression of Black people in the US that's now being addressed is what Indigenous peoples around the world have experienced for decades and even centuries. So, so I think we need to get organized at all levels, community groups, NGOs, associations. We need to, from more considered, more kind of organized ways of letters and electing leaders that have the right orientation. So I think we have to work at all these levels. And as I've said a couple of times now, that you young dynamic leaders in the Model UN, you have so much to offer in this regard. Let me just think if there's anything else to add. Oh, religious leaders, I think, have a lot to offer. And that's why I've spent the last 2.5 years working with religious leaders of all faiths on these issues, because apparently 84% of all human beings associate with one religion or another. And so they have huge political power, economic power, and moral authority. So to answer your question, David, one thing that I'm doing is is working with religious leaders to educate them about the urgency of this tropical forest issue, because for them, it's a human rights issue, it's an environmental justice issue, and it's a sanctity of life issue. So mobilizing the religious leaders is part of the answer to your question, David, and I'm seeing encouraging things happening. The Interfaith Rainforest Initiative is working in just 5 countries: Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and the Amazon, Indonesia, and Democratic Republic of Congo. So those 5 countries, only 5 countries out of 195 UN members, but those 5 countries hold 70% of all the remaining tropical rainforest. So in those countries, religious leaders are starting to stand up. And the most exciting thing that I'm seeing is they're forming a new kind of bond with the indigenous peoples. After 500 years of terrible, even oppressive relationship, there's now a reconciliation happening through this work. So that, imagine how powerful that is. Religious leaders, indigenous leaders together on this issue can exert a lot of pressure on governments to do the things I talked about. I'll stop there.
Thank you, David. So I think just following that up and just compiling a lot of the questions we got from a lot of delegates. So I'm just going to collectively ask that to you. You talked about indigenous communities, and you've talked about interfaith dialogue and the need, the requirement of getting faith into this. So to inculcate the moral aspect of things. But I think one thing which a lot of delegates have been asking is that indigenous communities, as you already mentioned, have been really neglected for a very long time now, especially in the current scenario where governments are neglecting their needs and even their indigenous right over their land. What do you think, in your opinion, is a way in which these indigenous communities can be empowered? And if I think education is a very good way of doing that, how could that be incorporated? Or if there's anything else, what in your opinion can we do to empower them to actually stand up for their rights rather than being oppressed by their government?
Great, thank you very much. I'd say that the response to the question how to empower indigenous peoples to live a better life or live the life they want is to give them rights over their lands. It's really, they don't need or want a lot. It's more, they want less from the outside world rather than more many times. Less intervention, less building of roads into their land, less poaching of the wildlife on their land, less introduction of diseases to them into their lands, less poisoning of their water with mercury as those gold miners come in, less mining, less logging. So it's really, they want probably less, but what they really want is rights to their land, that in most of these cases, these people have lived there for thousands of years, and then other people have come in and overrun them. And so giving them, as I mentioned earlier, giving them rights allows a lot of important things to happen, a lot of good things to happen for the environmental issue that we're discussing. So that's kind of the main thing on that. And I think with regard to the religious and indigenous people's connection, I think that as I said, that we need to motivate governments to implement the kinds of laws and enforcement and finance to stop deforestation. And this is going to require a sea change in public opinion and activism. And so we think that we need to inspire people in new ways to reach them at a deeper level, the level of values and ethics. And that's why we started the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, is to reach them at that level. And as I said earlier, that linking the indigenous peoples with religious leaders, that is a way to really help defend indigenous peoples, because religious leaders have told us they're ready to invest political, economic, and moral authority on their behalf. And so that's another part of the solution.
Thank you, Dr. McNeill. And seeing as we are almost in time, I'll just ask one last question to you. It's just a final finishing question. So we've discussed so much and you've given such a brilliant insight to us on this issue. What is the road forward for the youth on this issue? What do you think us as the young leaders of tomorrow, or even in our current scenario, what can we do to help out in this, or plan the future and, make amends, make amends to the mistakes of our ancestors?
Thank you. That's great. Yes. Well, I can think of 4 points. One is in the personal choices that we take, our personal responsibilities, that each of us can set a positive example in our own lives through the food we eat and other consumer choices. As I mentioned, beef, soy, palm oil, pulp and paper are together responsible for a huge share of deforestation globally. So a shift towards a plant-based diet, eating less meat, particularly less beef, is one of the most powerful and effective personal choices any individual can make in solidarity with rainforests, believe it or not. And reducing food waste is also key, because every bit of food wasted represents a squandering of the land and resources that produced it. And as I said, 1/3 of food grown worldwide is wasted. And we can support companies that are committed to zero deforestation. Secondly, we can get involved and support a wide range of charitable activist and educational groups that are working on these issues. That there's, in each of the countries and communities you are, I'm sure there's an NGO, a civil society group working on these issues that you can support. Volunteer with them, sign up with them, communicate their information. So secondly is to support these organizations. Third, every economic decision we make is also a moral decision. So there are investor movements to exert shareholder pressure on businesses that are doing bad things. So you can exert pressure on businesses to clean up their behavior, their supply chains, using financial assets. And maybe as young people, we may not have a lot of money yet, but keep that in mind, that as you can influence the economic system. And then fourth is probably most important, is to raise awareness, impact the public debate, impact the policies by leveraging your influence and authority everywhere you can. Share information, stand up, speak out, demand a response from government officials, because ending deforestation comes down to mobilizing sufficient political will. And until now, globally and in major rainforest countries, the establishment and enforcement of laws around forests has been insufficient to stop deforestation. We need government authorities at all levels to feel your pressure to adopt and implement the laws needed. You hold the key to success, and we at the UN are thrilled to be in partnership with you and thrilled to welcome you into the ranks of this global body and this global movement.
Thank you. And on that note of making small changes in our lives to make a big change to society, we conclude today's session. Thank you so much, Dr. McNeill, for that amazing, amazing session. And just before we wrap up, this is a recommendation from Natabara. If we could have everyone switch on their cameras, so Dr. McNeill can see us all from different parts of the world. So if everyone is comfortable switching on their cameras. So this is our online.
Oh, I see. I had to do gallery view. Oh, wow. Look at all of you great people. Sorry, I was not seeing you all. Oh my goodness. Look at all you wonderful young leaders. Wow. Wow, that's impressive. What a group. I'm so happy to have had a chance to be with you and talk to you. Thank you for the opportunity to enter your lives for this little bit of time.
You certainly have left a mark on it as well. Thank you so much. And we hope to see you in the future as well, in future summits. And with that,
thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for joining in.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you so much. What a great group. It's a pleasure, an honor to speak with you.
And I'll just leave the final remarks to Natabara and Cody. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, we have to shut down because we have to go to our social hour, but we're just so grateful that you all could tune in, hear from my old boss and dear friend, Charles McNeill. We've been together, working together since 1996, and we have lots more stories, so hopefully we can have him back for the next summit to detail some of our adventures and how we've tried to change the world in a good way, and invite you all to join. So thank you all. And we have to sign off now. Thanks again, and Doctor, and we'll see you all soon in the next session.
Thank you so much. All the best. Blessings to everyone. Stay healthy, stay safe, light up the world.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, Dr. McNeill.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
And we'll see
Thank you.
We'll see you all again.
Thank you very much.